20 years collapsed into a single heartbeat. Standing at the nurse's station, reviewing charts with the confidence of someone who belonged there, was Angela Brooks. The woman he'd dismissed, discarded, and tried desperately to forget. The blood ran cold as one question echoed. How many more pieces of himself would he recognize in this stranger? Hi viewers, kindly tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. Warm welcome to the family. Enjoy the story. He was staring at his own face, 20 years younger, wearing a doctor's coat, and calling another woman mom. What if the child you never knew existed grew up to hold your life in their hands? Have you ever run from a mistake so completely that you forgot it could run right back to you? Richard thought money could bury the past. He was wrong. Stay with me to discover what happens when 20 years of secrets collide in one explosive moment. The sterile hospital hallway stretched like a courtroom, fluorescent light harsh as Judgment Day. Richard's Italian leather shoes squeaked against polished floors as he approached the reception desk, unaware he was walking toward his reckoning. "Mr. Calloway? Room 312 for your cardiac consultation," the nurse announced, her voice cutting through the medical chaos around them. Richard straightened his designer tie, the same nervous habit he'd carried since building his construction empire from Dallas dirt. At 55, he commanded boardrooms and million-dollar deals, but hospitals made him feel mortal, vulnerable, human. He rounded the corner and stopped dead. 20 years collapsed into a single heartbeat. Standing at the nurse's station, reviewing charts with the confidence of someone who belonged there, was Angela Brooks. The woman he'd dismissed, discarded, and tried desperately to forget. She looked up. Their eyes met across 2 decades of silence, and Richard felt every carefully constructed wall around his heart crack. She was beautiful still, more beautiful, actually. The uncertain young woman from his Dallas mansion had been replaced by someone who carried herself like she owned the world. Her natural hair framed her face in confident coils, her white coat crisp with authority, her wedding ring finger notably bare. Angela. The name escaped him like a prayer. Her jaw tightened. Mr. Calloway. No warmth, no recognition of what they'd shared. Just professional ice that could freeze hell. Before he could process the earthquake of seeing her again, a voice interrupted. "Ready for your consultations, sir?" Richard turned and felt his knees buckle. The young man extending his hand possessed Richard's exact jawline. Those were Richard's green eyes staring back at him, his own nervous half-smile from 25 years ago, even the way he tilted his head when concentrating. Richard recognized it like looking in a time machine. "Dr. Marcus Brooks," the young man said, shaking Richard's trembling hand. "I'll be handling your case today." Brooks, Angela's last name. Richard's chest tightened, not from his heart condition, but from a mathematical impossibility staring him in the face. This couldn't be coincidence. This couldn't be genetics playing tricks. This young doctor who looked like Richard's younger brother couldn't be. Funny thing, Marcus continued conversationally as he led Richard toward the examination room. "I always wondered why Mom never talked about my real father." The air turned electric. Richard's world tilted sideways as the pieces clicked into place like bullets loading into a chamber. 20 years ago, he'd walked away from Angela Brooks without looking back. He'd never asked if their secret nights together had consequences. He'd assumed his cowardice had only destroyed one life. He'd been catastrophically wrong. As Marcus confidently reviewed his file, Richard caught Angela's protective gaze, following every movement her son made. She watched like a mother protecting her greatest treasure from a threat she'd never stopped fearing. Questions crashed through Richard's mind like accusations. Did she struggle alone while pregnant? Did she work multiple jobs to pay for this brilliant son's education? Did she lie awake nights, wondering if the man who abandoned her would someday want to claim the child he'd never known existed? And the most terrifying question of all, how many more pieces of himself would he recognize in this stranger who called Angela Mom? Tell me in the comments, do you believe in karma? Have you ever had your past catch up with you in the most unexpected way? As Marcus extended his hand for the consultation, Richard noticed the small scar on the young man's wrist, the same scar he'd carried since childhood from a bicycle accident in Texas. His blood ran cold as one question echoed. How many more pieces of himself would he recognize in this stranger? She'd spent 20 years building armor around her heart, until her former employer walked back into her life, looking exactly as guilty as the day he destroyed it. Angela's office overlooked the city skyline, floor-to-ceiling windows reflecting her journey from Dallas domestic worker to Baltimore medical administrator. She'd climbed every rung of success, but seeing Richard's face brought her crashing back to that humiliating night when everything fell apart. Her hands shook as she poured coffee, memories flooding back like poison in her veins. Dallas, 1999. She'd been 23 and desperate for a fresh start after moving from Atlanta with nothing but dreams and determination. Richard Calloway had been 25 and hungry, building his construction company with the kind of ambition that made wealthy families notice. She cleaned his mansion, organized his chaos, stayed late when his fiancée was too busy with charity galas to care about Richard's 14-hour workdays. Those late nights had been dangerous. Professional boundaries blurred when storm knocked out power and candlelight revealed desire they'd both been fighting. She remembered the weight of his hands on her waist, the way he'd whispered her name like it mattered, how safe she'd felt in his arms despite knowing it was temporary. "You sure about this?" he breathed against her neck that first night. "More sure than I've ever been about anything," she'd answered, letting 23 years of careful boundaries melt under his touch. 3 months of stolen moments. 3 months of believing love conquered everything. 3 months of thinking she mattered to him beyond convenience. Until his fiancée's family discovered their secret. The memory still burned. Richard's trembling hands as he counted out severance pay, his eyes unable to meet hers as he destroyed both their worlds with clinical precision. "Leave tonight. Never contact me again. If anyone asks, nothing happened between us. What about what I feel for you? What about my reputation? My business? You think I can throw away everything for this?" She discovered the pregnancy 6 weeks later, alone in a Baltimore clinic with no money and no choices. But she'd kept Marcus anyway, working 3 jobs through medical school applications, refusing every government program that felt like charity, building a life from nothing but stubborn pride and love for the son who'd never know his father. Now, watching Marcus conduct Richard's examination with professional efficiency, Angela felt that old protective rage returning. Her son had grown into everything Richard could never be: kind, principled, brilliant without cruelty. Marcus saved lives instead of destroying them. "You seem familiar with our administrator, Mr. Calloway," Marcus observed, checking Richard's blood pressure with steady hands that belonged to a healer, not coward. "We knew each other. Long time ago," Richard managed, his voice tight with guilt that was 20 years too late. "Not nearly long enough," Angela said from the doorway. Marcus looked between them, his analytical mind processing undercurrents he couldn't quite identify. Small world, I guess. If only he knew how small. Have you ever had to face someone who hurt you after they've forgotten you even existed? Drop a broken heart if you felt invisible to someone who changed your entire life. When Marcus casually mentioned his mother's stories about working for some rich man in Dallas who thought help was disposable, Richard's world tilted. Angela hadn't just moved on. She'd raised their son to understand exactly who his father was. Or wasn't. The DNA test results lay on the desk between them like a loaded gun. And both Angela and Richard knew only one of them would survive the truth intact. Richard had called in favors, used hospital connections, pulled strings that money could buy. The laboratory processed genetic material with clinical efficiency while his conscience screamed protests. He had no right to investigate paternity without Angela's permission. No right to invade Marcus's privacy. No right to anything after 20 years of absence. But those green eyes haunted him. That familiar scar. The way Marcus tilted his head when thinking. Exactly like Richard had done since childhood. Coincidence had limits, and genetics didn't lie. The hospital laboratory hummed with quiet efficiency, Machines processing secrets that could shatter families or heal decades of wounds. Richard waited outside like a prisoner awaiting his sentence, his empire of wealth and success meaningless against the possibility of fatherhood he'd never claimed. 99.7% probability of paternity. The words hit him like physical blows. Marcus was his son, his brilliant, compassionate, accomplished son who'd grown up believing his father was a coward who thought people were disposable. Richard wasn't wrong. The door opened behind him. Angela stood there, her face stone cold with fury that could melt steel. "So," she said, her voice deadly quiet. "You couldn't just let sleeping dogs lie." "Angela, you what? You had to confirm what you suspected? You had to violate my son's privacy to satisfy your guilty conscience." She stepped closer, and Richard caught the scent of her perfume. Different now, more expensive, chosen by a woman who could afford preferences instead of accepting whatever was cheapest. "Let me make something crystal clear," Angela continued, her finger pointed at his chest like a weapon. "Marcus doesn't know you're his father, and I intend to keep it that way. You walked away once. You don't get to walk back in now. But he deserves to know. He deserves better than you." The words cut deeper than any knife. "He's everything you never were. Compassionate, loyal, someone who doesn't abandon people when they become inconvenient." Richard felt the weight of 20 years pressing down on him. She was right. Marcus had become extraordinary despite his absence, not because of it. Angela had raised a son who saved lives while Richard had spent 2 decades caring only about profit margins. But genetics were complicated. In the examination room, Marcus had been having dreams about a man with green eyes. When he mentioned this to Angela later, she realized with growing dread that Richard's presence was triggering memories Marcus had somehow suppressed, fragments of paternal connection he'd never consciously known existed. What would you do if someone tried to prove paternity without your permission? How far would you go to protect your child from a painful truth? The test results arrived with clinical precision, 99.7% probability of paternity. But as Richard stared at the paper, he realized he wasn't just Marcus's father. He was about to become the man who could destroy his son's world by existing in it. She invited him to dinner not as forgiveness, but as warfare, and the battlefield was her son's future. Angela's row house glowed with warmth. Family photos covering every surface. Marcus's medical school diploma prominently displayed, evidence of a life built from determination and love. Richard felt like an intruder in a museum of his own failures. The invitation had surprised him. After their confrontation about the DNA test, he'd expected lawyers and restraining orders, not a carefully worded request to discuss Marcus's future over dinner. Angela Brooks had learned to choose her battles, and apparently, she'd chosen this one. Marcus greeted him at the door with the kind of genuine smile Richard had never learned to give freely. "Mr. Calloway, Mom said you two worked together in Dallas." Small world, right? If only the boy knew how small. The dining room felt intimate in ways Richard's mansion never had. Mismatched furniture that spoke of careful budgeting, candles that were necessity rather than ambience. Marcus's childhood artwork still framed on walls because Angela treasured everything her son created. "So tell me about Dallas," Marcus said, serving the kind of home-cooked meal Richard hadn't tasted in decades. "Mom never talks about her time there." Angela's eyes met Richard's across the table, a warning and a challenge. How much truth could this conversation hold before it exploded into honesty none of them were ready for? "Your mother was..." Richard began carefully, watching Angela's face for acceptable boundaries. "The most capable person I'd ever met. Smart, dedicated. She deserved better than she got." "Better how?" Marcus pressed, his medical mind naturally seeking complete diagnosis. The kitchen timer saved them from immediate confession, Angela rising to check dinner rolls with movements that betrayed her nervousness. Richard followed instinctively, muscle memory from 20 years ago when they'd worked together in perfect harmony. Their hands touched in soapy dishwater, accidentally, inevitably, and time collapsed. Richard remembered the intimacy of working beside her in his mansion, the way she used to hum while organizing his chaos, how he'd watch her move through rooms like poetry in motion. Angela jerked back like she'd been burned, but not before he caught the recognition in her eyes. Her body remembered him too. "Mom," Marcus called from the dining room. "You've never dated anyone seriously. Were you waiting for someone?" Angela's pause revealed everything. She had been waiting, not for Richard to return, but for someone who could love her son the way fathers were supposed to. Someone who wouldn't run when loving got complicated. The dinner conversation continued with careful politeness, but undercurrents of history charged every exchange. Marcus asked about business. Richard answered while studying the young man's gestures, recognizing himself in every movement. Angela watched both men with the protective intensity of someone who'd fought alone for 20 years and wasn't about to stop now. When was the last time you sat at a dinner table where everyone was keeping secrets? Where one conversation could change everything? Share your most awkward family dinner story below. As Richard prepared to leave, Marcus grabbed his arm with the confident grip of someone accustomed to making life-or-death decisions. "I know this sounds crazy," Marcus said, studying Richard's face with scientific intensity that missed nothing. "But you have the same hands as me, the same eyes, and my mother looks at you like you broke something that never healed." The question hung between them like a sword waiting to fall. How long could they keep pretending when genetics wrote the truth across Marcus's face every time he smiled? She'd locked away 20 years of memories, but seeing him in her home broke every seal, flooding her with the taste of what love felt like before it became abandonment. Angela stood at her bedroom window, watching Richard's car disappear into Baltimore traffic, her heart racing like she was 23 again and stupid enough to believe rich men kept promises to poor women. The dinner had been a mistake. She'd intended to control the narrative, keep Marcus safe from dangerous truths, maybe shame Richard into maintaining his distance. Instead, she'd watched her son connect with his father, seen recognition spark in both their faces, felt her own defenses crumble under the weight of suppressed longing. Dallas flooded back like a dam breaking. The mansion had sprawled like a monument to ambition, Richard's first major success built brick by brick through 18-hour days and ruthless determination. Angela had arrived from Atlanta with nothing but hope and a willingness to work harder than anyone expected. The job was simple: keep his life organized while he built his empire. But late nights had their own rules. His fiancée was always busy. Charity events, social obligations, networking dinners that mattered more than a man struggling to prove himself worthy of her family's approval. Angela stayed late because Richard worked late, helping with contracts and paperwork, sharing Chinese takeout when he forgot to eat, listening to dreams and fears he couldn't share with his social circle. The night everything changed, Storm had knocked out power throughout Dallas. Candlelight turned his office into something intimate, shadows dancing across walls while rain pounded against windows like nature demanding attention. "You don't have to stay," he'd said, but his eyes were pleading. "Where else would I go?" she'd answered, meaning it. They'd been working side by side, his sleeve rolled up, her hand brushing his as she organized financial documents. The electricity between them had been building for months. Glances that lasted too long, conversations that became confessions, the way he said her name like it mattered. When he looked up from the contracts, rain painting silver streaks down the window behind him, Angela saw past the wealthy facade to the uncertain young man who worked himself to exhaustion trying to prove he belonged in rooms full of old money and older prejudices. "Angela," he whispered, and her name had never sounded like prayer before. She'd moved toward him without thinking, drawn by something deeper than attraction. When his hands found her waist, when his mouth covered hers with desperate hunger, 23 years of careful boundaries dissolved like sugar in rain. "You sure about this?" He'd breathed against her neck, giving her the last chance to save them both from crossing lines they couldn't uncross. "More sure than I've ever been about anything," she'd answered, letting her guard drop completely for the first and last time in her life. 3 months of stolen paradise. 3 months of believing love conquered class differences and social expectations. 3 months of him sneaking into her small apartment, bringing flowers and promises, making love to her like she was precious instead of convenient. Until his fiance's family hired private investigators. The memory burned worse than physical pain. Richard's hands trembling as he counted out severance money, his voice hollow as he repeated words someone else had obviously scripted. Leave tonight. Never contact me again. If anyone asks, nothing happened between us. What about what I feel for you? What about us? What about my reputation? My business? You think I can throw away everything for this? She'd gathered her dignity and walked out, but the damage was done. 6 weeks later, staring at a positive pregnancy test in a Baltimore clinic, Angela had faced the choice that defined everything after. Keep the baby and raise him alone, or give up the only piece of love she had left. Marcus had been born 8 months later, carrying his father's eyes and his mother's determination to survive. Now, 20 years after that betrayal, her phone rang with Marcus's excited voice. Mom, I ran some tests. My patient Richard Calloway. There's something I need to tell you about his blood work. Something that connects us more than you ever told me. When someone shows you who they really are in a crisis, do you believe them? Have you ever loved someone who was too cowardly to choose you? Tell me in the comments. Back in present day, Angela's phone rang. Marcus's voice excited. Mom, I ran some tests. My patient Richard Calloway. There's something I need to tell you about his blood work. Something that connects us more than you ever told me. Marcus thought he was diagnosing a patient's heart condition until he realized he was discovering his own father's identity through medical records. Marcus's apartment reflected his methodical nature. Medical journals stacked precisely, diplomas arranged symmetrically. But tonight, papers scattered across his floor like evidence of a crime. Genetic test results mixing with birth certificates and old photos Angela had never shown him. The blood work had been routine. Richard Calloway's cardiac panel, family history forms, genetic markers for inherited heart conditions. Standard procedure for any thoracic surgeon worth his degree. But the genetic markers weren't standard at all. Marcus stared at the results spread across his coffee table, his medical training warring with emotional chaos. The blood type matched his own. The genetic sequences showed patterns he recognized because he'd seen them in his own medical files. The inherited cardiac weakness Richard displayed was the same condition Marcus monitored in himself quarterly. This wasn't coincidence. This was paternity written in chromosomes and mitochondrial DNA. Mom, he called, his voice cracking like he was 13 again instead of 25 with steady surgeon's hands that could restart hearts and save lives. Angela appeared in his doorway, took one look at the papers scattered across his floor, and knew her 20-year secret had just died. How long have you known? Marcus asked, his voice deadly quiet. She sat across from him like they were negotiating a hostage situation. Known what? That Richard Calloway is my father. The words hung between them like accusations. That the man whose life I held in my hands today created me 26 years ago and walked away. Angela's composure cracked. 20 years of protection, of carefully constructed stories about his father being someone who couldn't stay, of working 3 jobs to pay for his education rather than asking for help that would have been his birthright. All of it crashing down because her son was too brilliant for his own good. I was 23 and stupid enough to believe love conquered everything, she admitted, her voice breaking. He showed me different, but I never regretted having you. Not for 1 second. Marcus found an old photo she'd hidden in his baby book, his parents together, their chemistry visible even in a candid shot. Richard's hand rested protectively on Angela's waist, her smile genuine and unguarded. For the first time, Marcus saw his mother as a woman who had loved deeply and been destroyed for it. He just left. His fiance's family found out. Rich families don't like scandals. Angela's voice carried 2 decades of carefully managed pain. He chose his reputation over us. Over you. Marcus picked up Richard's medical file, studying the cardiac readings with new understanding. His father needed family medical history for proper treatment. The irony was knife-sharp. The son Richard had abandoned now held the genetic keys to saving his life. But more than irony burned in Marcus's chest. This was his chance to understand the man whose absence had shaped every decision he'd ever made. The father who'd given him green eyes and healing hands, then walked away before either mattered. How would you react if you discover your father had been hiding in plain sight? Would you want a relationship, or would you protect your mother from more pain? Share your thoughts. Marcus made a decision that would shock both his mother and Richard. He requested to be Richard's primary cardiologist. "If he's my father," he told Angela, his jaw set with determination that looked exactly like Richard's, "then I'm going to save his life. And then I'm going to decide if he deserves to be in ours." The son he never knew existed now held his life in trained hands, and Richard couldn't decide if this was justice or torture. The cardiac wing buzzed with controlled urgency, monitors beeping life rhythms, nurses moving with practiced efficiency. Richard lay vulnerable in the hospital gown, while Marcus studied his charts with the detached interest of a scientist examining a specimen. "Your condition is more serious than we initially thought," Marcus said, his voice professionally neutral. "The genetic markers indicate inherited cardiac weakness. I'll need complete family medical history to proceed with treatment." The irony would have been funny if Richard's life wasn't hanging in the balance. His son, the child he'd abandoned, needed information about a family Richard had spent 20 years pretending didn't exist. My family doesn't have history of heart problems," Richard managed. "Then this is likely environmental." Marcus made notes with steady hands that belonged to a healer, not a destroyer. "Stress, lifestyle choices, emotional trauma. All can damage heart muscle permanently." Richard wondered if guilt counted as environmental damage. If 20 years of wondering what happened to Angela and trying not to think about consequences could literally break a man's heart. Angela visited during his treatment, their forced proximity in the small room creating electricity that had nothing to do with medical equipment. Marcus noticed everything. How his mother's hands shook when she looked at Richard, the unresolved tension crackling between his parents like live wire. "You two have history," Marcus observed, checking Richard's for with clinical efficiency. "Ancient history," Angela said quickly. "Ancient history doesn't make people's heart rate spike when they're in the same room," Marcus replied, studying Richard's monitor. "Your pulse jumps 20 beats per minute every time she walks in." Richard caught Angela's eye. Even unconscious, his body recognized her presence, responded to her proximity like muscle memory that couldn't be erased by time or distance. The treatment sessions continued for days. Marcus monitored every heartbeat while studying the man who'd contributed half his DNA and none of his character. Richard tried desperately to connect with his son, sharing stories about his business, asking about Marcus's medical training, searching for common ground that didn't require acknowledging their biological connection. But Marcus remained professionally distant until Richard's condition worsened suddenly. The monitors started screaming at 3 a.m. Richard's heart rhythm became chaotic, his blood pressure dropping toward dangerous levels. Angela arrived as Marcus prepped for emergency surgery, fear replacing anger in her eyes as she watched the father of her child fight for life. "If something happens to me," Richard grabbed Marcus's arm before they wheeled him toward surgery, his voice desperate with 20 years of unspoken regret. "Tell your mother I'm sorry. Tell her she deserved better than a coward." Would you trust your life to someone you'd abandoned? Would you risk everything to save someone who'd hurt your family? Comment below with what you'd do. Mid-surgery, Richard's heart stopped. As Marcus fought to restart it, he realized with startling clarity that he wasn't just trying to save a patient. He was trying to save his chance at having a father. The question was, did Richard deserve to be saved? Sometimes saving a life means confronting every reason you had to let it end. Recovery rooms held a special quiet, machines humming reassurance while families whispered prayers. Richard looked smaller in the hospital bed, mortality making him seem human instead of just wealthy. The surgery had taken 6 hours. Marcus emerged exhausted, surgical mask hanging around his neck, his hands still steady despite the emotional earthquake of restarting his father's heart. Angela waited in the hallway, her face pale with fear she couldn't hide anymore. "He's stable," Marcus announced. Full recovery expected. Angela collapsed into a chair with relief that surprised them both. Despite 20 years of anger, she didn't want Richard to die, especially not while Marcus was trying to save him. In the recovery room, Richard woke to find Marcus checking his monitors with the same focused intensity he'd inherited from his father's business dealings. Different applications, same drive for perfection. "You saved my life," Richard said, his voice rough from intubation. "I saved a patient's life," Marcus corrected, but his eyes held something softer than professional duty. "That's what doctors do." But they both knew this was different. Marcus had held his father's heart in skilled hands, felt it stop beating, shocked it back to life with controlled electricity and sheer determination. The metaphor wasn't lost on either man. Your heart muscle was damaged. Scarred, Marcus explained, reviewing the surgical notes. But with proper care, it can heal stronger than before. Both men understood he wasn't just talking about cardiac tissue. Angela fell asleep in the visitor chair, exhaustion finally claiming her after days of maintaining her protective walls. Richard studied her face in the dim light, remembering how peaceful she'd looked in his bed 20 years ago, his hand almost reaching out to touch her hair before stopping himself. She'd aged beautifully. Stress had carved lines around her eyes, but strength had carved deeper ones around her mouth. She'd survived his abandonment, raised their son alone, built a career that demanded respect rather than begging for it. Everything about her spoke of battles fought and won without him. She never dated anyone seriously, Marcus said quietly, catching Richard's stare. 25 years I've been alive, and she's never brought a man home. Never even talked about dating. I used to think she was just focused on her career. The implication hit Richard like physical pain. Angela had loved him so completely that his betrayal had shut down her ability to trust anyone else. She'd raised their son alone, not because she had to, but because no one else could live up to the standard of love he destroyed. When Marcus prepared to discharge his patient, Richard asked the question that had been burning in his chest since he woke up. "What would it take for you to let me try to be your dad? Do you believe people can really change? That someone who abandoned you could become someone worth knowing? Tell me about a time someone surprised you with growth." Marcus's answer would determine whether 20 years of absence could be overcome. "Prove to Mom that you're not the man who broke her. Then we'll talk." He'd conquered Dallas real estate, but winning back the heart he broke 20 years ago would be his greatest construction project. Baltimore's Inner Harbor sparkled in evening light as Richard waited at Angela's office building, holding coffee from the small shop he'd learned was her favorite. Not from wealth or convenience, but from careful attention to who she'd become. 3 weeks since his surgery. 3 weeks of Marcus maintaining professional distance while Richard recovered. 3 weeks of researching Angela's life with the same obsessive attention to detail that had built his business empire. She'd earned her MBA while raising Marcus alone, worked her way up from file clerk to medical administrator through night classes and weekend shifts, volunteered at community centers, served on scholarship committees, built a life that mattered beyond just surviving. The woman who emerged from the office building bore no resemblance to the uncertain young maid from his Dallas mansion. This Angela wore confidence like expensive perfume, carried herself like someone who knew her worth and refused to settle for less. Richard, she stopped short, seeing him waiting with coffee that smelled like cinnamon and attention to detail. "What are you doing here?" Trying to apologize properly. He held out the coffee cup, remembering she'd always added cinnamon to the pot when she made coffee in his mansion 20 years ago. For 20 years of cowardice, Angela studied the cup like it might contain poison or promises, both equally dangerous. Coffee doesn't fix abandonment. No, but it's a start. She took the cup anyway, her fingers brushing his for the first time in 2 decades. The contact sent electricity through both their bodies, muscle memory responding to familiar touch despite years of separation. "I researched your life," Richard admitted as they walked toward her car. "Your degrees, your career, Marcus's achievements. I know about the scholarship fund you started, the community health program you developed. You built something incredible. I built something necessary. Angela's voice carried no self-pity, just statement of fact. Single mothers don't get the luxury of falling apart. The words cut deeper than any accusation. While he'd been building wealth and social status, she'd been building character and raising their son to be the kind of man Richard had never learned to be. I want to make it right, he said. You can't. 25 years of Marcus's life can't be made right. 20 years of me working 3 jobs to pay for his education while you bought second homes can't be made right. She stopped walking, turning to face him with eyes that held storms. What you can do is stay away from us. But even as she said it, her body betrayed her. She noticed he still wore the same cologne. Her pulse quickened when he accidentally brushed her arm. Her anger mixed dangerously with old attraction that had never fully died. Richard had researched more than her career. He learned about her mother's medical expenses that Angela was still paying off, the community center that needed funding, the scholarship program that helped kids like Marcus had been. Money couldn't buy forgiveness, but it could demonstrate commitment. Anonymous donations started appearing. Marcus's medical school debt mysteriously forgiven. The community health program receiving a grant that covered operations for 5 years. Angela investigated every dollar, finding Richard's signature on checks that proved he'd been paying attention to what mattered to her. When someone hurts you deeply, what would it take for them to earn a second chance? What gestures mean more than words? Share your thoughts on forgiveness. Angela agreed to one dinner, just dinner, to discuss Marcus's future. But as she chose her dress that night, she realized she wasn't preparing for a business meeting. She was preparing for a date with the only man who'd ever made her feel like she was worth fighting for. She walked into that restaurant as the woman she'd become, not the girl he'd abandoned. And for the first time, Richard realized what he'd actually lost. The restaurant glowed with understated elegance, white tablecloths and candlelight creating intimacy without pretension. Angela entered wearing confidence like jewelry, every eye turning to appreciate her transformation from the uncertain young woman Richard remembered. He stood when she approached, his sharp intake of breath visible as he took in the sight of her. The dress hugged her curves perfectly. Her hair fell in natural waves that framed her face. Her smile was polite but guarded. This wasn't the eager-to-please maid from his Dallas mansion. This was a woman who knew her worth. You look beautiful, he said, pulling out her chair with the nervous energy of a teenager on his first date. Thank you. No blushing, no giggles, no gratitude for basic courtesy. Angela Brooks had learned the difference between politeness and desperation. The evening began carefully. 2 people who'd shared everything trying to navigate a dull conversation loaded with landmines. Richard told her about his business expansion, his move to Baltimore, his growing understanding of what he'd thrown away. Angela spoke about her work, Marcus's residency, the community programs that gave her life meaning beyond survival. But underneath professional conversation, electricity crackled. The way Richard's hands shook slightly as he reached for the wine menu. How Angela's breath caught when their fingers brushed. The chemistry that had destroyed them both 20 years ago was still there, complicated now by maturity and consequence. You're not the same person I knew in Dallas, Richard observed, studying her face like he was memorizing it. No, I'm better. I had to be. Angela met his gaze steadily. Question is, are you? The challenge hung between them. Richard had spent 20 years building wealth while Angela had built character. He'd accumulated possessions while she'd accumulated wisdom. The boy who'd chosen reputation over love needed to prove he'd become a man worth trusting. I hope I am, he said honestly. I know I want to be. Angela softened slightly at his vulnerability. The Richard she'd known had never admitted uncertainty, never showed weakness. This version sitting across from her seemed capable of growth. He told her about following Marcus's medical career from afar, keeping newspaper clippings of his achievements, feeling pride he had no right to claim. Angela listened with the protective expression of a mother hearing someone praise her greatest accomplishment. He doesn't know you've been watching his career, she said. I know. I had no right. But I couldn't help being proud of who he became, who you raised him to be. The admission cracked something in Angela's chest. For 25 years, She'd carried the responsibility of Marcus's success alone. Hearing someone acknowledge her achievement, recognize her sacrifice, made her feel less like a single mother and more like a woman who'd accomplished something extraordinary. What would convince you that someone has truly changed? Is it words, actions, or time? Tell me what real growth looks like to you. As Richard walked Angela to her car, she turned suddenly, stepping closer than she'd been since Dallas. "I need you to understand something," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "I'm not the grateful little maid anymore. If you want me, you'll have to earn me." The challenge in her eyes made his pulse race in ways boardroom negotiations never had. Richard thought earning Angela's trust would be his hardest challenge, until Marcus decided to test whether his father deserved a place in their carefully constructed world. The medical conference buzzed with Baltimore's finest doctors, but Marcus only had eyes for the man across the room. Richard stood among hospital board members, his expensive suit fitting perfectly among people who measured worth in degrees and donations rather than construction contracts and real estate deals. 3 months had passed since that first dinner. 3 months of Richard courting Angela like a teenager, bringing flowers to her office, learning her favorite books, discovering the woman she'd become while he wasn't paying attention. She was softening toward him. Marcus could see it in how she smiled when Richard texted, how she chose her clothes more carefully on nights they had dinner plans. But Marcus remained unconvinced. Love songs and fancy restaurants couldn't erase 25 years of absence. His father needed to prove he'd changed where it mattered most. "Dr. Brooks," Marcus approached Richard during the reception, his voice carrying medical authority. "I'd like you to meet some colleagues." Richard turned, his face lighting up with nervous pride. Being acknowledged publicly by his son felt like receiving an award he'd never earned. "This is Richard Calloway," Marcus announced to the group of doctors surrounding them. "He's a successful businessman who's recently taken interest in community health care." The introduction was masterful manipulation. Marcus had given Richard an opening to prove himself, or expose his true character in front of people whose opinions mattered in Angela's professional world. Community health care? Dr. Patricia Williams, the hospital's chief administrator, looked intrigued. What kind of interest? Richard felt the weight of expectation, the careful test his son had constructed. Every word would be reported back to Angela. Every response would be weighed against the man who'd abandoned them both. "I'm learning that wealth without purpose is just accumulation," Richard said carefully. "My son, Dr. Brooks, has shown me healthcare shouldn't depend on zip codes or bank accounts." Marcus's eyebrows rose slightly. Richard had claimed him as his son, publicly and without hesitation. "We need funding for prenatal care in underserved neighborhoods," Dr. Williams continued, studying Richard with the sharp assessment of someone who'd heard plenty of empty promises from wealthy donors seeking tax breaks. "What would that cost annually?" Richard asked, pulling out his phone to take notes like this conversation mattered more than profit margins. The doctors exchanged glances. Most wealthy donors asked about naming rights and publicity opportunities. This man was asking about operational costs and sustainable funding. Marcus watched his father navigate the conversation with genuine interest, asking intelligent questions about healthcare access, listening when doctors explained community needs. This wasn't performance for Angela's benefit. Richard was actually learning, actually caring about problems that didn't directly affect him. When the conversation ended with Richard promising to review funding proposals, Marcus felt something shift in his chest. Not forgiveness, that would take more time, but recognition that maybe, possibly, the man who'd contributed to his DNA was capable of growth. Later that evening, Marcus found Richard and Angela having coffee in the hospital cafeteria, their conversation intimate despite the public setting. They looked like a couple working through complicated history, not strangers pretending politeness. "That was well played," Marcus said, sitting across from them. "The community healthcare conversation wasn't playing," Richard replied. "Your colleagues are brilliant. The work they're describing matters." Angela studied Richard's face, searching for signs of manipulation she'd learned to recognize 20 years ago. But his interest seemed genuine, his questions thoughtful rather than calculated. The prenatal program would serve neighborhoods where young mothers work multiple jobs and can't afford regular checkups, Angela explained, testing his reaction. Like you did, Richard said quietly, when you were pregnant with Marcus. The acknowledgement hung between them. Richard finally admitting the pregnancy he'd refused to face, the struggle he'd forced her to endure alone. Yes, like I did. Marcus felt the weight of their shared history, the pain and regret that couldn't be erased but might, eventually, be transformed into something productive. What's the difference between charity for publicity and charity for change? Have you ever had someone try to prove they'd grown by actions instead of words? Share your thoughts on authentic transformation. As they prepared to leave, Richard handed Marcus a business card with numbers written on the back. My accountant's contact information. I'd like to fund the prenatal program, anonymously, and I'd like you to oversee the medical implementation. For the first time in 25 years, Marcus felt like he might actually want to know his father. Angela thought she'd buried her past completely, until Richard's ex-fiancée arrived in Baltimore, carrying secrets that could destroy everything they'd rebuilt. The knock on Angela's office door came during lunch break, unexpected and sharp enough to make her coffee cup rattle against its saucer. Through the frosted glass, she could see an elegant silhouette that triggered memories she'd spent 20 years trying to suppress. Victoria Hamilton entered without invitation, her designer heels clicking against polished floors like countdown timers. She looked exactly as Angela remembered. Blonde hair, perfectly styled, clothes that cost more than most people's monthly rent, the kind of confidence that came from never questioning whether you belong somewhere. Angela Brooks. Victoria's voice carried the same cold authority it had possessed in Dallas when she destroyed Angela's world with calculated precision. Or do you prefer Dr. Brooks now? Angela's blood turned arctic. Richard's former fiancée stood in her office, 20 years older, but carrying herself with the same entitled cruelty that had once reduced Angela to tears and unemployment. What do you want, Victoria? To discuss your recent reunion with Richard. Victoria settled into the visitor chair like she owned it, crossing her legs with practiced elegance. Imagine my surprise discovering that the help we dismissed has managed to work her way back into his bed. The insult was designed to wound, but Angela had grown armor since Dallas. She leaned back in her chair, studying Victoria with the calm assessment of someone who'd learned her own worth through battles this privileged woman had never fought. Careful, Angela said quietly. You're not in your daddy's dining room anymore. This is my office in my hospital, where I'm respected for my brain instead of dismissed for my background. Victoria's smile turned predatory. Still defensive about your place in society, I see. Some things never change. But everything had changed. The uncertain young woman who'd cleaned Victoria's family mansion was gone, replaced by someone who commanded respect in boardrooms and medical conferences. Angela had earned her position through merit, not marriage or inheritance. Richard seems quite taken with you again, Victoria continued, her tone suggesting surprise that anyone could find Angela interesting twice. Though I suppose desperation makes men sentimental about past mistakes. The words were calculated to hurt, but Angela felt only pity for a woman who could only see relationships as transactions and people as disposable assets. Why are you really here, Victoria? Did you come all the way to Baltimore just to remind me you exist? I came to warn you. Victoria leaned forward, her voice dropping to conspiratorial whisper. Richard has a pattern. He gets sentimental about the past when his present gets complicated. His business is struggling. Financial pressures make men nostalgic for simpler times. Angela felt ice forming in her stomach. She'd researched Richard's company, knew he'd expanded rapidly, but she hadn't investigated his current financial status. You're lying. Am I? Ask him about the Dallas contracts he lost last quarter. Ask him about the Baltimore projects that fell through. Ask him why he moved here. Was it really to be closer to his newfound son, or because staying in Dallas meant facing creditors? The seeds of doubt planted themselves before Angela could stop them. Had Richard's romantic pursuit been genuine or desperate? Was he seeking love or financial stability through reconnection with the son he'd abandoned? Even if that were true, Angela said, her voice steady despite the chaos in her chest, I'm not the same woman you destroyed 20 years ago. I don't need anyone's money or protection. Victoria's laughter was sharp as broken glass. But your son might. Medical school debt, residency salaries that barely cover rent, the pressure of proving himself worthy of the Brooks name he carries instead of Calloway. Richard could make Marcus's future very comfortable or very difficult. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Victoria was suggesting Richard might use financial pressure to control his son, to force relationship through economic dependence rather than earning it through genuine change. Richard would never. Richard chose money over you once. What makes you think 20 years changed his priorities? Angela felt the carefully constructed confidence she'd built beginning to crack. Not because Victoria's words held obvious truth, but because they contained just enough possibility to plant seeds of fear. Have you ever had someone from your past show up to remind you who you used to be? How do you handle people who try to make you doubt progress you've made? Tell me about overcoming voices that want to keep you small. As Victoria prepared to leave, she paused at the door with one final poison arrow. Ask Richard about his debts, Angela. Ask him why he really moved to Baltimore. Then decide if his sudden interest in family is about love or survival. The office felt contaminated after Victoria left, her perfume lingering like smoke from fires that destroyed everything they touched. Richard built his empire on ambition and charm. But when both crumbled simultaneously, he faced the choice between destroying his son's trust or losing everything he'd worked to create. The Baltimore offices of Calloway Construction felt smaller than they should, empty spaces where employees used to work before the layoffs began. Richard stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, watching traffic move with purpose while his world collapsed in careful, calculated stages. The financial statements spread across his desk told stories of overexpansion and miscalculation. The Dallas market had shifted while he'd been focused on Baltimore. Contracts had fallen through when investors discovered his company's geographic split was stretching resources too thin. The ambitious leap into Maryland construction had become financial suicide. Marcus knocked on the office door, his face carrying concern that felt like judgment. Dad? You missed dinner with Mom last night. She's worried. The word Dad still sent electric shocks through Richard's system. 25 years of absence couldn't be erased by 4 months of tentative relationship building. But hearing it now, while staring at bankruptcy papers, felt like receiving gifts he'd never deserve. Just business complications, Richard said, turning from the window to face his son's analytical stare. Marcus had inherited his father's ability to read people, unfortunately paired with his mother's intolerance for dishonesty. What kind of complications require lawyers who specialize in Chapter 11 proceedings? Richard's stomach dropped. Marcus had obviously researched the legal firm whose cards lay scattered across the desk. His son's medical training had made him naturally investigative. Nothing escaped scrutiny when someone's life was in your hands. You've been watching my business? I've been trying to understand my father. Marcus entered the office fully, closing the door behind him with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to delivering difficult diagnoses. Mom thinks you're courting her because you've changed. I thought maybe you were courting her because you love her. But Victoria Hamilton visited Mom yesterday. Richard felt his world tilt sideways. Victoria's name in the same sentence as Angela's triggered every protective instinct he'd spent 20 years ignoring. What did she tell her? That you're broke. That your romantic interest coincides suspiciously with financial desperation. That maybe you're not seeking family reconnection, but economic survival. The accusation hit like physical blows because it contained enough truth to be devastating. Richard had moved to Baltimore partly to escape Dallas creditors. His pursuit of Angela had begun during his company's decline. The timing would look calculated to anyone seeking patterns. Marcus, I need you to understand. I need you to be honest. Marcus stepped closer, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who'd held beating hearts in his hands. Are you using us? The question demanded complete honesty that could destroy everything Richard had worked to rebuild. But lying would be worse. Marcus would discover the truth eventually, and deception would poison any chance of authentic relationship. My business is failing, Richard admitted, sitting heavily in his chair like confession required physical surrender. I overexpanded, trying to prove myself worthy of your mother's attention. I wanted to be successful enough to deserve another chance with both of you. Marcus listened with the same focused attention he gave terminal diagnoses, gathering information before making decisions that would affect everyone's future. The community health funding you promised, can you still honor it? The question revealed everything about his son's character. Marcus wasn't concerned about inheritance or personal benefit. He was worried about promises Richard had made to help people who needed medical care regardless of their ability to pay. Yes, that money is protected in a separate account. Whatever happens to my business won't affect the healthcare funding. Marcus studied his father's face, searching for signs of deception he'd learned to recognize from 20 years of protecting his mother from disappointment. Mom doesn't know about the financial problems? No. And Victoria's visit was designed to make her doubt my motivations. Are your motivations genuine? Or are you hoping family connections might provide financial solutions? The brutal honesty of the question forced Richard to examine his own heart with uncomfortable clarity. Had his pursuit of Angela been about love or survival? Was he seeking genuine relationship or calculating advantage? Both, Richard admitted, his voice cracking with the weight of complete honesty. I came to Baltimore because Dallas was becoming impossible, but I stayed because seeing you both again reminded me what actually matters. Money built my business, but it never built anything that made me happy. Do you believe someone can have mixed motives and still deserve forgiveness? Can love be genuine even when it's inconveniently timed? Share your thoughts on complicated human emotions. Marcus made a decision that would either save or destroy his father's last chance at redemption. Tell Mom the truth tonight. All of it. Let her decide if your love is worth your debts. The ultimatum hung between them like a medical procedure that might save the patient or end everything permanently. Angela had survived 20 years of independence, but hearing Richard's complete truth would test whether her heart was strong enough to risk depending on someone who'd already broken it once. The Harbor View restaurant glowed with amber light, candles flickering across Angela's face as she waited for Richard to explain why he'd requested this urgent dinner. Something in his voice had sounded desperate when he'd called, the kind of controlled panic she remembered from medical emergencies. Richard arrived, looking disheveled in ways she'd never seen. His usually perfect hair mussed, his expensive suit wrinkled, his hands shaking slightly as he pulled out her chair. This wasn't the confident businessman who'd been courting her for months. You look like someone died, Angela observed, studying his face with the analytical skills she developed managing medical crises. Something did. Richard sat across from her, his green eyes carrying defeat that made him look older than his 55 years. My pretense that I had everything under control. The confession began slowly, each word carefully chosen to inflict maximum honesty without destroying her completely. Richard explained the business failures, the overexpansion that had seemed brilliant when he was trying to prove himself worthy of her attention, the mounting debts that threatened everything he'd built. Angela listened with the same calm focus she brought to medical emergencies, gathering information before making decisions that would affect everyone's survival. How bad is it? Chapter 11 bad. Maybe Chapter 7 if the Baltimore projects don't recover. Richard met her eyes steadily, refusing to soften the reality that could change everything between them. I'll lose the company. Probably the house. Most of the assets that make me look successful enough to deserve someone like you. Someone like me? Someone who built their life through merit instead of inheriting advantages. Someone who earned respect rather than demanding it. Someone who raised an extraordinary son alone while I was accumulating wealth that turned out to be borrowed time. Angela felt the familiar sensation of ground shifting beneath her feet. The same vertigo she'd experienced 20 years ago when Richard's world had collapsed and taken her with it. Victoria said you were using us, she said quietly. That financial desperation made you nostalgic for simpler times. Richard's laugh was bitter as unsweetened medicine. Victoria would think that because she's never made a decision that wasn't calculated for advantage. But she's not entirely wrong about the timing. The admission hung between them like a surgeon's knife, sharp enough to cut away pretense, but dangerous enough to cause permanent damage. I came to Baltimore partly because staying in Dallas meant facing creditors daily. My pursuit of you began while my business was declining. Anyone looking at the timeline would see suspicious correlation. Angela studied his face, searching for signs of manipulation she'd learned to recognize 2 decades ago. But Richard looked defeated rather than calculating, vulnerable rather than predatory. What are you asking me to do with this information? Decide if my love is worth my debts. Decide if you can trust a man whose motives are complicated by desperation. Decide if you want to risk your heart on someone who might lose everything except his feelings for you. The restaurant buzzed around them, other couples enjoying uncomplicated dinners, while Angela wrestled with questions that had no safe answers. Love Richard while he was wealthy? That felt shallow. Love him while he was broke? That felt dangerous. Marcus knows. I told him this afternoon. He said you deserved complete honesty before making any decisions about our future. Angela felt pride in her son's wisdom mixed with terror about the decision he'd forced her to make. Marcus had given her all the information she needed to protect herself, or risk everything on a man who'd abandoned her before. The community health care funding, protected in a separate account. Whatever happens to my personal finances won't affect the medical programs we've planned. The assurance mattered more than Richard probably realized. Angela had spent 20 years learning to distinguish between men who protected others during their own crises and men who sacrificed everyone else to save themselves. 20 years ago, you chose your reputation over me, she said, her voice steady despite the chaos in her chest. Now you're choosing honesty over self-preservation. What changed? Richard reached across the table, his fingers barely touching hers. I learned the difference between losing money and losing everything that makes life worth living. I lost you once because I was too cowardly to choose love over convenience. I won't lose you again because I was too cowardly to choose truth over comfort. Have you ever had to choose between safe love and risky love? Between protecting your heart and following it toward uncertain futures? What would you do if someone offered you complete honesty that might hurt you? Angela's response would determine whether financial ruin would destroy their second chance or prove that some foundations were strong enough to rebuild on. Richard Calloway, are you asking me to be broke with you? His answer would change everything. I'm asking you to be real with me, whatever that costs us both. 25 years after their first kiss, Angela and Richard discovered that some foundations are strong enough to build on twice, if you're brave enough to risk everything on love instead of safety. The small courthouse in downtown Baltimore had witnessed thousands of life-changing moments, but few carried the weight of redemption that filled the air as Angela Brooks prepared to become Angela Calloway. The ceremony was simple, just family and friends who understood that sometimes the most important promises are made quietly. Marcus stood as his father's best man, his medical residency scrubs traded for a Navy suit that made him look like the distinguished doctor he was becoming. 6 months had passed since Richard's financial confession. 6 months of watching his parents rebuild their relationship on honesty instead of convenience. The business recovery had been slower than hoped. Calloway Construction survived Chapter 11 proceedings, but Richard's days of empire building were over. He'd kept the company small, focused on community projects that mattered more than profit margins. The man who'd once measured success in dollars had learned to count victories in lives improved. Angela wore her grandmother's pearl necklace, the only jewelry that had survived her journey from Atlanta to Dallas to Baltimore. The pearls caught afternoon light streaming through courthouse windows, reflecting a journey that had taken her from domestic worker to medical administrator to bride for the second time in her life. The first time, she'd married Marcus's father out of hope mixed with desperation, a young single mother seeking stability for her son. That marriage had lasted 3 years before ending amicably when both parties realized friendship wasn't enough foundation for lifelong commitment. This time, she was marrying Richard from strength rather than need. She had her own career, her own home, her own identity that didn't require rescue or validation. Choosing him now meant choosing love over safety, complicated history over comfortable distance. Nervous, Marcus asked his mother as they waited for the ceremony to begin. Terrified, Angela admitted, adjusting her simple blue dress that she'd chosen because Richard had once said it made her eyes look like storms clearing into sunshine. Good terrified or bad terrified? The kind that comes with doing something that matters. Angela smiled at her son, still amazed by the man he'd become despite having an absent father for most of his childhood. Are you okay with this? Really okay? Marcus considered the question with the same careful attention he gave medical diagnoses. His parents' relationship had been his primary concern for months. Not their happiness, which was obvious, but their ability to weather difficulties that would inevitably arise. He held your hair while you were sick with food poisoning last month, Marcus said finally. He researched your favorite books so he could discuss them intelligently. He voluntarily attended every community health meeting even when they lasted past midnight. Those aren't grand gestures. They're daily choices to care about your comfort. The observation revealed everything about what Marcus had been watching for. Not romantic displays or expensive gifts, but evidence that Richard had learned to put Angela's needs ahead of his own convenience. Richard entered wearing his best suit, the one he bought for their first dinner date 4 months after his surgery. His hands shook slightly, not from medical issues, but from the magnitude of promises he was about to make to people who'd survived his previous failures. The ceremony began with words that felt less like legal formality and more like medical procedure. Carefully performed rituals that could heal old wounds or inflict new damage depending on the skill and commitment of everyone involved. When Judge Martinez asked if they would take each other for better or worse, richer or poorer, both Angela and Richard laughed because they'd already tested most of those conditions. They'd navigated Richard's financial collapse, Angela's trust issues, Marcus's protective skepticism, and Victoria's attempts to poison their reunion. I promise, Richard said, his voice steady despite 25 years of mistakes he was trying to redeem, to choose you every day, especially on days when choosing you costs me everything I think I want. I promise, Angela replied, her eyes bright with tears that contained both grief for lost years and joy for found possibilities. To trust you with my heart again, and to forgive us both for being human instead of perfect. Marcus officiated the ring exchange, his steady surgeon's hands guiding his parents through promises that felt less like wedding vows and more like peace treaties between people who'd survived war and chosen reconstruction over revenge. The reception was held at the community center where Richard now volunteered, serving barbecue to the same neighbors who'd watched Angela struggle as a single mother years earlier. The celebration mixed medical colleagues with construction workers, proving that love could bridge differences that seemed impossible to cross. As the evening ended, Angela and Richard stood on the center's front steps, wedding rings catching streetlight like promises made visible. Any regrets? Richard asked, still unable to believe she'd chosen complicated love over simple safety. Only one, Angela said, reaching up to straighten his tie with the intimate familiarity of someone who'd earned the right to touch him whenever she wanted. I regret we were too young and stupid to do this right the first time. Think we'll do better now? I think we'll do differently. And different might be exactly what we need. What does it mean to love someone for who they've become instead of who they used to be? Have you ever gotten a second chance at something precious you thought was lost forever? Tell me about love that grows stronger after being tested. Marcus joined them outside, his expression carrying the peaceful satisfaction of someone who'd watched his parents choose courage over comfort. So, he said, grinning with the same confidence he brought to complex surgeries, when do I get to be the big brother? Angela and Richard looked at each other, both realizing simultaneously that some foundations were strong enough to support dreams they'd never dared to build before.